Fundamentally, what we're looking at is whether board oversight of risk management actually makes any difference at all. I mean, there's been big push for risk management given the financial crisis and many other things, including the economy now. And so institutional investor companies, regulators have been pushing boards to do more board oversight of risk management. The question is it real or is it just window dressing? Do you just see companies putting this in because this is what everybody wants? So what we're looking at, does it really make a difference how board does risk oversight? Does it have an impact on the risk management practices of the companies? And ultimately, does it pay off? Do firms have lower risks when they have more board oversight and higher stock returns? Well, one important thing is it really matters who is responsible on the board for risk management. There's a lot of controversy right now in terms of should it be the board as a whole? Should you have a committee like the audit committee responsible for this? Should you set up a separate risk management committee? And various regulators, groups have taken different stances on this. If you're a member of the New York Stock Exchange, your audit committee is required to do board risk oversight. The Australian Stock Exchange is completely different. They say the entire board should be responsible for board oversight. And the financial institutions, a lot of them are required to have a separate risk committee. So one big issue was, okay, does it really matter where you put this? And it turns out it matters a lot. You better have the entire board responsible instead of delegating this to something like an audit or a risk committee. And something really interesting was, even if you have a separate risk committee, seemed to have zero impact overall in terms of what the company does in terms of risk management practices and performance. So there is an instance where it does look like it may be window dressing. Boards are putting this in. They're setting up separate risk committees to look like, we're paying a lot of attention to enterprise risk management. But in truth, it really does not look like it makes all that much difference if you do that as opposed to using existing board structures. Well, I guess some of it was just pure descriptive statistics because we did this. This was a survey of companies that we did in conjunction with Aon, the big insurance broker. And one of the interesting things was how informal a lot of the discussions between the board and the top management are in terms of risk management. You would think these days companies would make these much more formal in terms of things like risk appetite. How much risk are we really willing to take on? Because the idea of risk management is not get rid of risk. Do it within your risk appetite. And risk tolerance. How much variability am I willing to take on this? And you just look at the survey responses. These are people admitting that, well, if we do it, it's very informal. And we found this very surprising given the atmosphere now that you would think boards would be much more formal in trying to figure out what is the risk appetite we want to go after and what kind of tolerances, how much variability are we willing to accept once we've done this. But it's very, very informal. Again, one of the big things is who is going to be responsible. You really have to set in your charter having the whole board responsible. Now, you may decide that certain types of risks are handled by different committees. So obviously financial risks are generally the audit committee, but you might have other risks go to other committees where the expertise is. But overall, the board has to be responsible. This is not something you can delegate. The other thing is you have to have much better communication between the board and your senior management. Because what we found out is if the only time that you actually talk to senior management about risk practices is during the annual or quarterly board meetings, it's very detrimental. You really have to have these discussions outside the board meetings and an ongoing review of what is our risk appetite, what is our risk tolerance. You need to hire a risk expert, somebody who's an expertise. Once you've identified here are our key risks, you need to have somebody on the board. And this is part of the problem with delegating it to a committee. Right? The audit committee, which is generally the committee that's responsible, their expertise at financial risks, credit risks, market risks, we're going to use derivatives or not use derivatives. They know almost nothing about cybersecurity. And that's where you're seeing the big push that once the board kind of spends time figuring out where our issues are, maybe that's when you need expertise there, that you can't expect to just take existing board members to know much about this stuff. If nothing else, have them figure out who is the risk expert they're going to hire within the firm and enhance the communications that go on, even if you don't have somebody on the board specifically who has that expertise. I think one of the big issues is risk is a responsibility of the audit committee. And it's all an issue of that's where traditionally risk is. We've always thought of financial risks in the companies. It's not that companies don't think about risks, but it's always been financial risk, credit risk that people have worried about. I'm in an accounting department. Let me tell you, finance and accounting people are not experts at any kind of risk outside financial risks. So putting it there, which is the requirement of the New York Stock Exchange listing, as the board audit committee will have board oversight over risk, is just not right. And especially as you pointed out, as you expand the number of risks we're facing, or at least recognize them even if we've had them in the past, this notion that it should be the board audit committee because they've always done risk is not right. They've always done financial risks. They just do not have the expertise outside there. Well, people generally have looked at, is there some association between some overall risk management index or score and things like firm variability and stock price? We're really trying to say, okay, what are the mechanisms here? Right? If I'm a manager, just saying, okay, I should have better risk management really is not going to help you much. What I want to know is, how do I organize my firm? And the reason we start at the board is the whole notion that the tone is always set at the top. Forget about worrying about how I do individual risk management. The first thing you got to do is get the whole company on board. And it's got to start with the board of directors. And that's very different than what other people have done, because until you could say, well, what's the mechanism I have to put in place to make sure that we put risk management as a strategic issue in the firm, there's no point. There are requirements in the United States and other countries where there's actually board performance evaluation. Very few people actually realize this, but you're supposed to evaluate the performance of your own board. And part of it is actually putting responsibility for risk management practices and board oversight into the performance evaluation on this. And what we actually did find in our results that companies that actually, one, they do performance evaluations of their boards, and two, they incorporate risk management responsibilities in the evaluation, actually were the ones who put in better risk management practices. So again, incentives and accountability are key, not just looking at the managers in your firm, but also looking at the board, and getting their incentives aligned with risk management. Well, part of what we're looking at is, when you look at what's the objective of risk management in your company, how does that impact which practices you're going to put in and what the implications are? Because one simple way to think about risk management is all we're trying to do is avoid risks, or at least mitigate them if they happen. That's only looking at the downside of risk. But if you really believe that there's a risk-return trade-off, which is the only way to make higher returns is to take on more risk, you can also use risk management to increase the value of the firm. Let's take on the right risks. Let's figure out where I have multiple risks in the firm, how they interact with each other, such that I don't take one that has a big impact on somewhere else. So when you take companies that really see risk management as a value-enhancing objective, as opposed to just a cost minimization or avoid a problem, how does that impact the practice you actually put in and which ones are more effective? And ultimately, how does that impact firm performance? And some of our initial results suggest that it makes a huge difference. The firms that have looked at this as a value-enhancing objective, as opposed to just minimize costs or avoid the downside, are really the ones, those are the only firms really that are seeing any kind of real financial gain, as opposed to just minimizing costs from enterprise risk management practices.